Okay, just give me a thumbs up, man. I don't want to speak for half an hour and then somebody said you can't hear a word he says.
We can hear you.
Okay.
Great, thank you.
Okay, good evening all. And we're at Acts 23. Some of you will know me, and if you don't know me, let me just give a quick background that I was an English teacher. So I did a degree in English and taught English and was a headmaster for a while. And I've now retired and I'm just doing bits and pieces. But I think I read the Bible like an English teacher. And I guess you might read the Bible like whatever you are. If you're I know one of you is a sailor, so you probably read the Bible and you read it in such a way that it picks up bits and pieces of things that are relevant to your outlook on life. And I guess we all bring that to our readings of the Bible. The kind of experiences, the kind of education, the kind of background, the kind of interests we have. I find it fascinating to read Acts because of the history, the adventure, the stories, the dynamic, if you like, English literature of it. I enjoy the philosophy. I enjoy tying up bits of Acts with other bits of the Bible, particularly the letters of Paul. What did he write to the churches and what was his visit like as explained in Acts? And I enjoy the biography, imagining what was it like to be Silas or Barnabas or John Mark. So I guess in that sense, there's a kind of intellectual engagement that we have with the Bible of differing types. But fundamentally, what I have to try to pull myself back from is just appreciating a study of the Bible as interesting, as intellectually challenging, as philosophically stimulating. And I have to say to myself, well, hang on, it's more than that. If this is God's word, as it is God's word, then I want to hear what God is saying to me about what he's like, about what I'm like, and about how he wants to relate to me, how he wants me to behave, how he wants to speak to me, and how he wants me to respond to what he's saying to me. So I'm hoping that tonight we'll get all of those things. We'll get a stimulation in our minds. We'll enjoy the reflection on a period of history. We'll enjoy imagining what it was like to be Paul and how much we would like to be like him. But let's try to approach it through the prism that we always, I guess, try to. Lord, please show me more about what you're like. Please help me to understand better what is true about my life and about me and what you want to do with me and how I can respond to you. So with that kind of introduction in mind, we're going to try to look at the passage as a piece of text, but then spend the latter part of our time together asking those bigger questions about, well, what does this mean to me? And of course, God is an individual and God is interested in us as individuals. So he will have different individual things to say to us, each one, I pray. So I guess most of you will have your Bible with you. And if you have got a Bible handy, we're going to flick to some other, at least one other passage in addition to Acts 23. But let's read Acts 23 and stop as we go down it to pick up some bits and pieces. And then, as I say at the end, ask some bigger questions perhaps. So Acts 23 comes after Acts 22, which Paul looked at last week and brought us through the situation where Paul had been speaking to the Jewish people at the synagogue, at the temple, and was calling out in his defense why he was there and who he was and what he believed in. And at that stage, he was taken away because there was a kerfuffle, a furore. And we open Acts 23 after the Roman commander has taken Paul and for his own safety and calls together the council, the Jewish leaders, to have a separate meeting. So a Roman commander it's difficult to actually pinpoint this accurately, but if you imagine roughly 10 centurions would report to a commander. So if a centurion had 100 or 80 fighting men, that's debatable. A commander was potentially in charge of about 1,000 men. So just to get you that scale, bigger than a centurion by some distance. And so here he now says, right, I want to hear what the Jewish leaders have against this man, because there's something going on here I don't understand. And so he calls them together and says, okay, Paul, I'm listening, they're here, tell us. So we'll start verse 1. And Paul, looking earnestly at the council, the Sanhedrin, said, men and brethren, I have lived in all good conscience before God until this day. And the high priest Ananias commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. For you sit to judge me according to the law, and do you command me to be struck contrary to the law? So it's a pretty dramatic opening. Paul's standing there and he gets smacked in the mouth. The very opening words, Paul mentioned this last week, men and brethren, are the same words he used to the crowd in Acts 22. But in Acts 22, he says men and brethren and fathers, in the sense that perhaps he was talking to the whole community and the leaders of that community, as well as everybody else. But here in Acts 23, he doesn't use the word fathers. He's not speaking to everybody here. He's talking to the Sanhedrin. And he doesn't use the word fathers. And I'm intrigued, perhaps, that he sees himself as an equal. He was a Pharisee, as we'll find out, son of a Pharisee. Perhaps as he's talking to the council, he's not so much pleading a case as speaking to his peers. And he says, I've lived in all good conscience before God until this day. In my days as a Pharisee, in my days as a Christian persecutor, and now in my days as a Christian, in all of my days, I've lived in good conscience before God. Now, God's changed my understanding of who he is. Even when I was zealously persecuting Christians, I did it because I was trying to please God, and boy, I got it wrong. But immediately he opens his mouth, Ananias, the high priest, commands somebody to hit him. Now, the Ananias family is quite an interesting one. This is not likely to be the Ananias who sat in judgment over Jesus at the crucifixion. That Ananias and his son-in-law Caiaphas, you would be maybe surprised to learn that there were 28 high priests in the 50 years either side of Jesus being born and now at the time of Paul. They kind of changed more often than prime ministers. And this Ananias, we think, was one of Ananias's sons. So it was very much a family kind of dynasty. It was kept in the family. Josephus, the famous Jewish historian, had no great time for that family and calls them, amongst other things, hoarders of money. And if, as we'll find out later, Josephus, when talking about Pharisees and Sadducees, was very more critical of the Sadducees, of which Ananias was one. But it was Ananias who commanded the guy standing nearest to Paul, hit him in the mouth. As we go through Acts 23, you're going to hear echoes of Jesus before Pilate. You're going to hear echoes of Stephen and his persecution and his martyrdom. You're going to hear echoes of Peter and John before the high priest. You're going to hear echoes of the ways in which the world has judged godly men. And here, when he strikes Paul on the mouth, we're reminded of how they struck Jesus. And it was illegal. In Leviticus and in Deuteronomy, there are several passages which talk about how legal cases should be examined and prosecuted. if you're going to have somebody defending themselves, as Paul is here, in a kind of almost legal way, then you have to conduct yourself in a certain manner. And assaulting the witness or the accused is not, according to Leviticus and Deuteronomy, the way you should conduct yourselves. But we're going to find out as we go down this chapter that the high priests had a pretty fast and loose relationship with the law, both the God's law of the Bible and the law as to how they conducted civil business. So as well as it being illegal for them to have done this, Paul calls them out and says, how dare you? You're supposed to be to me and legally judging my case as to whether I've done something wrong and deserve the punishments that you're calling upon me. And yet you're breaking the law yourselves. And he calls them out and says, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. Again, an echo of Jesus, the way he described the leaders of the Jewish people when he called them whited sepulchres. Do you remember? In Matthew chapter 23, Jesus called them whited sepulchres. Whitewashed wall was an idiom. It was a phrase used at the time for a hypocrite. And it was used in not only in the Bible, but in secular literature to mean somebody whitewashed, somebody who is pretending, covering up what they really are. So it wasn't a term specifically coined by Paul or by Jesus. It was a term used in the day for a hypocrite. And Paul's saying, you want to judge me according to the law. Don't break the law by hitting me in the mouth. The power and strength of the criticism that Jesus gave to those Jewish leaders and that Paul is giving here is, I sometimes think, lost on us perhaps. And so I want to take you just for a short reading to Ezekiel chapter 34. One of those books that certainly I struggle to find in the Old Testament, but it's after Lamentations and before Daniel. So if you have got your Bible and you turn to Ezekiel 34, this is quite a stunning attack, really, on the Jewish leaders of that time. And you would expect the high priests to know their Old Testament, or whatever they called it, their scriptures. They didn't have a New Testament. I wonder whether or not they ever recognized that these words now could be applied to them. Of course, we always think that criticism is relevant to other people, but never to us. But if you have found Ezekiel 34, let's just read and remember Jesus called himself the Good Shepherd. Well, just hear the strength of judgment that God calls down on leaders who do not lead according to his word. Let's take from the beginning. The word of the Lord came to me. Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel. Prophesy and say to them, this is what the Lord, the sovereign Lord says. Woe to you, shepherds of Israel, who only take care of yourselves. Should not shepherds take care of the flock? But you eat the curds, clothe yourselves with the wool, and slaughter the choice animals, but you do not take care of the flock. You've not strengthened the weak, or healed the sick, or bound up the injured. You've not brought back the strays, or searched for the lost. You've ruled them harshly and brutally. So they were scattered because there was no shepherd. And when they were scattered, they became food for all the wild animals. My sheep wandered over all the mountains on every high hill. They were scattered over the whole earth, and no one searched or looked for them. Therefore, you shepherds, hear the word of the Lord. As surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord, because my flock lacks a shepherd, and so has been plundered and has become food for all the wild animals, and because my shepherds did not search for my flock, but cared for themselves rather than for my flock, therefore, you shepherds, hear the word of the Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says. I am against the shepherds and will hold them accountable for my flock. I will remove them from tending the flock so that the shepherds can no longer feed themselves. I will rescue my flock from their mouths. and it will no longer be food for them. For this is what the sovereign Lord says: I myself will search for my sheep and look after them. As a shepherd looks after his scattered flock when he is with them, so will I look after my sheep. I will rescue them from all the places where they were scattered on a day of clouds and darkness. I will bring them out from the nations and gather them from all the countries, and I will bring them into their own land. I will pasture them on the mountains of Israel, in the ravines, and in all the settlements in the land. And we could go on. A powerful critique of hypocritical leadership, and a list of failings in those first 10 verses, that we would not waste our time just looking over as Christian leaders, as some of us may be, just to check that none of that could be said of us. Of course, as an accumulated description, it describes people who were godless, who were absolutely the opposite of what God had called them to be. But let's just check whether or not in our leadership we strengthen the weak, encourage the weak, we bind up the injured, we hold people together. I'm not for 1 second suggesting that we're under the judgment of God that those shepherds were. But let's not just simply discard it and say, whoa, those were terrible people. Let's just make double sure that we are way, way better in all regards in our leadership, if Christian leaders we are. So going back to Acts 23, Paul is standing in the same line as Jesus did, calling out hypocritical leaders, all the worse because God relies on his leaders on earth to look after his flock, and these were doing the absolute opposite. Verse 4, and those who stood by don't apologize to Paul for smacking him in the mouth. They actually call him out and say, how dare you revile God's high priest? Verse 5, then Paul said, I did not know, brethren, that he was the high priest. For it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. Now, people might say, well, how did Paul know who the high priest was? Surely everybody knew. But the politics of the day were very complex. There was a time when Annas was the high priest and Caiaphas then was the high priest, and yet Jesus was taken to Annas. Were they both high priests at that time? Were they still alive when their sons, or when Annas' sons became high priest? It was a very fluid, complicated world, and I can't penetrate it, even though I've tried to study into it, other than to say, yeah, it was never particularly clear out of this family who was and who wasn't in charge. Many people think that Annas, that original person who judged Jesus, kind of was pulling the strings from behind the scenes, even when he didn't have the official title, and that's quite likely, isn't it? I notice Paul doesn't say, oh, I'm sorry. And I wonder why. I'm speculating here. I'm not going to say this is a theologically proven fact, but I wonder why he didn't say sorry. Maybe it's because I probably haven't broken the law, because when you don't speak evil of a ruler of your people, I don't consider you to be ruling the people correctly. And I don't know if that's right. I think Paul did have a respect for the structures. But did he really respect this family who had sent Christ to the cross and who continued to build their wealth through the illicit business of the temple? I'm not sure he respected them, and far less having taken a hit in the mouth for simply saying that he was acting in good conscience before God. Verse 6, but when Paul perceived that one part of the Sanhedrin were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, he cried out in the council, men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee. Concerning the hope and resurrection of the dead, I am being judged. And when he had said this, a dissension arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For Sadducees say there is no resurrection and no angel or spirit, but the Pharisees confess both. Then there arose a loud outcry, and the scribes of the Pharisees' party arose and protested, saying, "Oh, we find no evil in this man. But if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him, let us not fight against God." Now, when there arose a great dissension, the commander, fearing lest Paul might be pulled, commanded the soldiers to go down and take him by force from among them and bring him into the barracks. So what was Paul doing here? Was he just creating a bit of mischief? Because he recognized the theological contrariness between the two major ruling parties in the Sanhedrin, the Sadducees and the Pharisees. And you may have studied this yourself. You may or may not know that theologically, the two were at very distant ends of the pole. And yet they cooperated and collaborated within the Sanhedrin as the kind of defense mechanism against the Roman authorities. If we don't stand up and organize ourselves, they thought, the Romans will just impose everything on us. We have to be kind of representative of our people. And although they kind of pretended that they were united in a kind of united front to the Romans, they were massively divided. We're told in these verses that they disagreed on the resurrection, that the Sadducees didn't believe that there's a resurrection of the dead. They may have believed in some kind of Greek-like afterlife where there's a Hades and a Sheol and something, but there's no reward after death. There's no paradise. There's no heaven as Jesus would have described it. And yet the Pharisees believed that there is the resurrection from the dead. And you'll recognize that from some of the things that Jesus said to them at the time and some of the questions they brought about what happens if a guy marries several times in this life and who's he married to in heaven? A question asked by the Sadducees when they didn't even believe in life after death. But these two groups also disagreed about free will. That rings a bell, doesn't it? Are we acting as free agents and can choose what we do? Or is it all part of God's direction and fate, they would have called it? Sadducees and Pharisees disagreed about that. They disagreed about what translation of the scriptures they should use. Sadducees wanted to use the Old Hebrew, and the Pharisees wanted to use the Aramaic, more modern version. They disagreed about the translation of their scriptures. And more than that, they disagreed about whether or not the scriptures should be taken as God's authoritative word, or whether it could be added to and interpreted and kind of brought into modern meaning. And don't we have that around us today? That this can't mean what it means because God's got to move with the times. God's got to, we've got to update the Bible so that it can be relevant to modern people. That debate still goes on. Josephus describes, as I said earlier, a very socially divided, a strong dividing line between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Sadducees were basically the wealthy. They were the ones who kowtowed to the Romans. They were the political class. They were the kind of upper class who kind of snuggled up to the Romans, whereas the Pharisees were more common. They were the common people, more ordinary. And as we've said and heard, and as we're about to remember in the week before Easter, the Sadducees ran the illicit business of selling at extortionate prices sacrificial animals and using extortionate foreign exchange rates to bleed foreigners dry of their money before they put it in the temple coffers. And yet Paul, what was he doing? Was he just saying, I know how to get out of this awkward situation. I'll just throw a bomb in here. Or was it more than that? Of all the things that Paul could have said about why he was on trial, he chose to say, I'm here concerning the hope and resurrection of the dead. Now, if somebody asked you to say you've only got 6 words to explain what the gospel is, you've only got 6 words to have a conversation with a friend who's not a Christian, what would you choose as your topic? I've always thought to myself, I would probably say, what do you think of Jesus? I wouldn't go, who do you think made the world, or how long do you think it took, or how many angels are there, Or where did Adam get his daughters-in-law? Those are going to take us down all sorts of tangents. I've always tried to think, well, the best thing is to say, what do you think of Jesus? Because that will open a conversation. But Paul didn't say that was the wrong answer, but he chose to say, I'm here because of my hope and resurrection for the dead. Now, he never got a chance to expound on that, but I've just mused on that thought. Yeah, if I said to a friend of mine who's not a Christian, I just want to talk to you about, what do you think happens to you when you die? I think that's probably a pretty good opener. I think if you say nowadays, well, what do you think of Jesus? They'll say, oh, he's a great teacher and, very wise and, great man, great influence on literature and art and the world and law. And you'd have to then move them on to try to get them to say he's more than that. And it's an opening that you may have used, and it may work, and it does work. But Paul chose and hinted to me, I think, well, why not try this sometimes? What do you think is going to happen when you die? People are at the moment very much aware of that and have been for a year. And when we get out of lockdown and we get the chance to witness and we get the chance to do either door-to-door or street work or just witnessing with friends and neighbors or work colleagues, what will our conversation be to try to bring them to thinking of Christ as their Savior? Because we've got a lot to say about what life will be after death. We've got a lot to say about he who rose from the dead and who raised from the dead. We've got a lot to say about the hope that we have got, the hope that's got us through the last year. Because we know that whatever happens to us or whatever might have happened but hasn't happened to us in the last year of COVID, we know where we're going. We know who we've believed in, and our hope cannot be taken away from us. That's what Paul chose to say. The bottom line of why you've got me here in front of you is because of the hope that I speak about and the resurrection from the dead, which I am witness to, because I met the risen Christ. But of course, they didn't want to engage with that. They wanted to have a good old fight. So they had a good old fight. And there in the middle of it, we actually say, the Pharisees saying what Pilate said. We find no evil in this man. And then in the next paragraph, in the next sentence, they say something Gamaliel said. Remember, Gamaliel was one of the Sanhedrin, but he was a Pharisee. And he'd said, if we're fighting against God, we'll not win. In that kind of sitting on the fence position that he found for himself. But here's those echoes I was talking about earlier. The Pharisees are saying, actually, if he's talking about resurrection of the dead, we believe in that. So we don't think he's done anything wrong. And the Sadducees go, no, we do. Not only because he preached there was life after death, but remember, this is the guy who threw over the tables in our business. He called us out as crooked businessmen, using the temple, the house of prayer, as a den of thieves. He had no time for Jesus or any of his followers. And so you can imagine that actually, probably literally, they had got a hold of Paul. If they'd struck him in the mouth, they weren't going to hold back on grabbing his arm. Lest Paul might be pulled to pieces by them, I don't think should be taken metaphorically. I can think, given the heat of the argument that those two groups had, almost took the cork off a long-standing argument they had. The Sadducees wanted to see Paul dead. And they were grabbing, come on, no, he's going our way. And the Pharisees were trying to say, no, come on, let him go. We don't see anything wrong with him. Anyway, the Roman jumps in and gets him out by force back to the barracks. Verse 11. And it sits in the middle of the chapter, and it sits at the center of what I think we can take from tonight. The following night, the Lord stood by Paul. Whatever situation, whatever difficult place we find ourselves in, whatever we find about the accusations or the laughter, the mockery, the hatred we might feel from people who don't want to embrace Christ and want to hit us because we do. The Lord stands by you and me all the time. It's not like the Lord came and, had been a long way away and actually came and said, "Oh, Paul, I'm sorry I've been away. Let me come and have a chat." The Lord stood by him because the Lord is by us all the time. His Holy Spirit is with us. And lo, I am with you always till the end of the earth. And what a comfort. And whatever situation you're in, don't wonder that the Lord isn't around and doesn't know and isn't listening and isn't answering your prayer. The Lord is standing by you with his arm around you saying, "We'll get through this. I'll get you through this." What does he say to Paul? Be of good cheer, Paul. Does he say, "Don't worry, Paul, I'm going to sneak you out and I'm going to take you off to Greece and you're going to live forever, happily ever after on a beach"? No. He says, "For as you have testified for me in Jerusalem, you must also bear witness at Rome." And we know Paul. Paul wasn't going to go, "Oh, Lord, really? I've had such a lot of hassle and now you're not going to get me have more hassle at Rome?" No, I think Paul licked his lips and said, "Right, okay. So now I've done Lystra, Derbe, I've done all these places on my missionary journeys. Now I've done Jerusalem. Now they're going to pull me off to Rome, are they, Lord? Right, okay. If that's where I'm going next, you know what my life is. My life is to speak out for you, to speak about the hope and the resurrection that you've given me because you've risen from the dead and proved to me who you are. Okay, Lord, we're off to Rome then." I wonder if we would feel that if we've been through a really difficult trial for the Lord and he brings us through it and he said, "Okay, I'm going to take you in another one now." Would we kind of say, "But Lord, I've done my dues. I've paid me. I know I really stood up for you and it was really tough and I've really been bruised and hurt and you've got me through it. And now I just want kind of a reward of peace." But no, sometimes the Lord takes us through situations to make us stronger so we're ready for something that might even be tougher. And the example, of course, is Moses, isn't it? Moses went and looked after sheep for 40 years in preparation for looking after human sheep for another 40 years. The Lord doesn't bring us through difficult times to then suddenly say, "Oh, well done, you've done a difficult thing. You can now have a sunny beach in Greece." Sometimes he's preparing us for the next thing. But remember verse 11, wherever he takes us and stands beside us and gives us the strength to do whatever he calls us to. He will not call us to do anything which without his strength we can't manage. So what happens? Verse 12, "And when it was day, some of the Jews banded together, bound themselves under an oath, saying they would neither eat nor drink till they'd killed Paul." Okay, here's these guys who are supposed to be upholders of the law. They've just struck a witness in the mouth or an accused in the mouth when they shouldn't have touched him. And now they're planning a non-judicial murder. Some of them are saying, "Oh, let's not even bother with having a court case. Let's not even bother about the Sanhedrin making a case for the Romans. Let's just get 40 of us together and go and kill him." And you wonder, well, how did they kill Stephen and get away with it? If they weren't allowed to kill Jesus, how come they were able to stone Stephen? There's a very kind of undercurrent of chaos going on, even though there's the outside picture of the Roman state and the Sanhedrin and everything being done by the book and according to the law and the Torah and everything's done properly. We now have 40 men saying we're going to kill him. More than that, we're now going to create and hatch a plot. Verse 13, now there were more than 40 who'd formed this conspiracy. 40 to get one guy. Well, remember how many they sent to Gethsemane to get Jesus? Well, okay, you would say there were 13 there. Well, 12 because Judas had run. So maybe they needed more than 12 if they're going to capture Jesus and the other 11 disciples. But here's 40 of them that are going to kill Paul. You know, did they expect him to be transformed into Samson? And they came to the chief priests and elders and said, this is how Sneaky and they are. The chief priests and elders, who are supposed to do things by the book, said, we've bound ourselves under a great oath that we will eat nothing till we've killed Paul. Now you, therefore, together with the council, suggest to the commander that he be brought down to you tomorrow, as though you were going to make further inquiries concerning him. But we will be ready to kill him before he comes near. Who are these guys? These are guys who are going to the high priest, the Sanhedrin, those 71 men. And these guys are coming and saying, okay, council, this is how we'll do it. There's 40 of us. You just tell the commander, bring Paul down. We want to ask him some more questions. And we'll ambush him on the way. Now you go and do that. Who's running the show? But of course, there's so many people know about this plan. They've got loose lips. Verse 16, when Paul's sister's son, who? Did you really say Paul's sister's son? Who's he? When I read it first, I thought, goodness, never heard of him before. Don't know his name. But Paul's sister's son heard of the ambush. So the simple logic must be that Paul's sister lived in Jerusalem and her son, as a Jew, the nephew of a Pharisee, Paul, the grandson of a Pharisee, if Paul's dad was a Pharisee. So probably connected in that world, he's moving in those circles. He hears of the ambush. He hears the 40 guys can't keep it quiet. He hears about it. God has ears everywhere. Paul's sister's son hears of the ambush, entered the barracks and told Paul. You see, Paul wasn't under arrest. Paul was kind of being protected in the barracks. So his nephew was able to come in, and Paul called one of the centurions to him and said, take this young man to the commander, for he has something to tell him. And so he took him, brought him to the commander and said, Paul, the prisoner, called me to him and asked me to bring this young man to you. He's something to say to you. So the commander took Paul's nephew by the hand and went aside and asked privately, what is it you have to tell me? And he said, the Jews have agreed to ask that you bring Paul down to the council tomorrow, as though they're going to inquire more fully about him, but don't yield to them, for more than 40 of them lie in wait for him. Men who've bound themselves by an oath that they'll neither eat nor drink till they've killed him. Now, they're ready, waiting for the promise from you. The commander is quite clearly being warned. These people are after ambushing, hijacking, murdering this guy without any due process. Pilate's wife came to Pilate and said, I've had a dream about this man, Jesus. Don't have anything to do with him. Stay out of this. Pilate chose not to. This commander chose to act. Verse 22, so the commander let the young man depart and commanded him, tell no one that you revealed these. And he called for 2 centurions. You know, there's several references to centurions here. And I sometimes wonder whether any of the other centurions we meet in the Bible were one of these 2. We know that Jesus met a centurion and healed his servant. We know there was a centurion at the foot of the cross who recognized Jesus as divine. Now, of course, there were more than 2 centurions around at the time. But I wonder whether any of those centurions were having more than one role. But not to distract us. God doesn't choose to give us the names of these centurions. But he says to them, okay, prepare 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen. Hang on, wait a minute. There were 40 men going to try and kill Paul, one man. And now the commander's saying 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, 200 spearmen, 470 men, please. Can you get them to go to Caesarea, about 20 miles away, at the 3rd hour of the night, which if it's Jewish time, that's about midnight. If it's Romans time, it's about 6 o'clock in the morning. But anyway, before everybody's up, get 470 men to get this guy out of here. Well, what can be the explanation for that? Only, like Pilate, this commander is fearing a uproar. He's seen what's happened with the Pharisees and the Sadducees. That's just the council. If this gets out into the people, I'm not taking any risks. Well, I think I'd have probably trusted 200 soldiers, but he decides 470. Verse 24, and provides mounts to set Paul on and bring him safely to Felix the governor. Let's remember, Paul's not under arrest. If you've got 70 men on horseback and 400 marching soldiers, where are you going to put a prisoner? You're going to give him a horse? No, you're going to get him tied up, walking along with everybody else. But they provide a mount for Paul. Paul rides on a horse. You're not made to walk. Jesus rode on a donkey. Paul was going to safety under Felix the governor. The commander took the view, I've got to get this to higher authority. I can't do this on my own. And so he wrote a letter in the following manner. And just compare, as I read it, this to the way in which Pilate dealt with Jesus. Claudius Lysias, to the most excellent governor Felix, greetings. It's interesting, isn't it? They wrote their names at the beginning of their letters. We write ours at the bottom of our letters. This man was seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them. Coming with the troops, I rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman. And when I wanted to know the reason they'd accused him, I brought him before their council. I found out that he was accused concerning questions of their law, but had nothing charged against him deserving of death or chains. And when it was told to me that the Jews lay in wait for the man, I sent him immediately to you, and also commanded his accusers to state before you the charges against him. Wow. Whatever we think of the Roman Empire, here's a guy doing it by the book. A proper judicial process, which Pilate chose to ignore. The man was seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them. True of Jesus. Coming with the troops, I rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman. Obviously not relevant. But when I wanted to know the reason they accused him, I brought him before their council, and I brought him before myself. I found out that he'd done nothing according to something about their laws. He'd done nothing to deserve death. I washed my hands of him. So why didn't Pilate do what this guy did? And if he wasn't going to let him free, send it up for somebody else to pass that judgment? Well, will we ever know what was in Pilate's head? But Claudius Lysias, fair play to you. You got this done by the book. Verse 31. Then the soldiers, as they were commanded, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. Now that's halfway between Jerusalem and Caesarea. The next day, they left the horsemen to go on with him. So our 470 guys, I'm not sure I would be too keen if I'd been one of the 400. The 70 carry on in the horses with Paul on his horse, and they do the next 25 miles up to Caesarea. The other 400 have to march all the way home. They returned to their barracks. When the 71, the 70 horsemen and Paul, when they came to Caesarea and had delivered the letter to the governor, they also presented Paul to him. And when the governor had read it, he asked what province he was from. And when he understood that Paul was from Cilicia, he said, okay, I will hear you when your accusers have also come. Due process. Paul was going to get the chance to say exactly what he wanted. God was not going to leave Paul high and dry at the mercy of a mob to be martyred like Stephen. Paul's destiny was to bear witness to God in Rome. And the last sentence of the chapter. And he commanded him to be kept in Herod's praetorium. And I can imagine Paul licking his lips again and saying, oh, right, here's some more guys I can tell about Jesus. We come therefore to the end of our chapter. I wonder, what has this told me about God, about me, and about what he wants me to do? I can see all the interesting biographical details. I can compare the chapter with what happened with Paul, with Stephen and Jesus and Peter and John. But what I can see clearly here is that a godly life will be lived amongst the ungodly. God doesn't take us out of situations and give us beautiful, wonderful little places where there's only Christians who all agree with us and we live our lives there. The truth of this passage is the truth of Scripture, that godly people live our lives amongst ungodly. To some who we live amongst, they think we're quite harmless. They think perhaps we're a bit quaint, we're a bit old-fashioned, we're a bit, old school. In fact, some might even say, I didn't even know he was a Christian. I knew he was a good man, or I knew she was a kind woman. I just thought Christian was kind. I didn't know really. And that's a bit of a call out to us, isn't it? Are we anonymous Christians? There's a famous phrase, I think it was from either a song or a novel. If you were taken to court for being a Christian, would there be enough evidence to convict you? If I was taken to court, accused of being a follower of Jesus, believing in life after death and the hope that's only accessible of heaven through Christ, would there be any evidence to convict me? Would anybody say, oh yeah, I've heard him say that? Or would people say, no, I've never heard him say that? No. We live our lives among the ungodly, and for some, they don't even know the gospel. To some, however, we represent the enemy. In every sense of the word, Christ is their enemy. Christ's standards are anathema to them. What Christ calls them to do, they don't want to do. They want to reject. They don't want his law. They don't want his word. They don't want his commandments. They don't want to repent. They don't want to take up their cross and sacrifice the things that they sinfully want to do. They don't want to turn and follow him. Therefore, you and I are their enemy. And that's going to bring us attack and falsehood, discrimination and persecution. Why do you say that, Nigel? Because that's what happened not only in Acts 23, but that's what happens throughout the Bible. That those who follow God live amongst those who want to reject God and therefore want to shut us up. I once went through an experience and somebody said to me, Nigel, it's almost as if you're looking for trouble. You're looking to be persecuted. You're looking to have people attack you. And it wasn't that at all. I kind of understand what I think they were trying to get at. But it wasn't that at all. It was because I was trying to stand up for the truth that I believe the Bible exposes and reveals to us, that is absolutely vital for people's eternal destiny. But because I chose that path, I got it in the neck. And so did Paul, more than I did. We are like the wheat and the tares of Matthew 13. God is not going to uproot any of us until the time comes. We're going to live alongside people who are opposed to us. Wheat looks like tares, apparently, but wheat bears fruit. Tares don't. They're a weed, they're barren. We live alongside people who are going to hell. And what do we do about it? Well, Nigel, I don't know how to have the conversation, or I've told them 500 times and they don't listen, but they're going to hell. And I call myself out on that. How much do I care about friends who I would say, I've got good, strong friends who aren't Christians. Well, do they know? Well, I might lose them as friends. Well, does that matter if actually they need to hear the gospel? You might spend heaven with them if you tell them. If you don't, you won't. So this passage tells me what God's like, yes, but my life is going to be lived amongst the ungodly. And am I going to be like Paul and prepared to speak out for him because their eternal destiny is at stake? Or am I going to say, oh, that's too much persecution for me? But I go back to verse 11. Every day we have a choice, whether to witness, whether to live the lives that he's called us to and explain to others, give reason for the faith that is within us. Or we have a choice not to speak, or not to witness, or not to behave as we know God would want us. We all have a choice to make every day. We don't just have the choice to become Christians. Every day we make choices. Joshua says, choose for yourselves today whom you will serve. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. That's not just a once in a life decision to become a Christian. It's the choice every day to continue to sacrifice, to put down those things, to crucify the things that God doesn't like that are still in me. And not just to deal with my own personal purity, but to deal with what I witness to others. Verse 11 says, and in all of this, Christ stands at our side. I guess I don't have to say to you, tune in next week and find out what happens to Paul next, because I guess we all know what happens to Paul eventually, and it will happen to us eventually. It happened to Jesus very quickly. It happened to Stephen very quickly, and to James, the brother of Jesus, pretty quickly. But one by one, it happened to most of the disciples. They were killed for their faith. Not just what they believed in their heart, but that they dared to tell others about it. But just like Jesus revealed himself to Stephen, stood by his side at the top of that step or stairway, Jesus stands by us too. And may he give us it's not right to say may he give us the strength that he promises. He does give us the strength that he promises. Sometimes the strength is there and we don't use it and need it because we don't do anything for him. These are my thoughts on our chapter tonight. And please do tune in next week to see what more God might challenge us to think about. Thanks.